Old people take too long and don't tip. Cancel. Brandon Lee didn't even lower his voice as he tapped his phone screen, his words carrying through the open window to the elderly man standing on the curb outside the VA hospital. The afternoon sun glinted off something metallic around the old man's neck, but Brandon didn't notice as he pulled away from the pickup zone, already scanning for his next fare. He had no idea that the man he'd just abandoned had once flown faster than a speeding bullet at the edge of space, photographing Soviet military installations while enemy missiles tried desperately to reach him. He had no idea that within hours his face would be plastered across social media as the vilest example of disrespect toward those who served. Type honor if you believe our veterans deserve better than abandonment. Joseph Hunter McDonald stood on the curb outside the Denver VA Medical Center, watching the silver Honda Civic drive away. At 79 years old, Hunter had survived things that would have killed most men. Extreme altitudes where blood could boil, aircraft malfunctions at 3 times the speed of sound, Cold War missions so classified that he couldn't speak about them for decades. Yet somehow, being abandoned by a rideshare driver felt like a small but sharp betrayal, a reminder that the world had changed in ways he didn't always understand. Hunter had just completed his quarterly checkup, routine blood work, and examination to monitor his health. The appointments exhausted him more than they used to, and today he felt the weight of his years more acutely than usual. His daughter usually drove him, but she'd been called into work unexpectedly, so Hunter had insisted he could manage on his own. He'd requested an Uber using the app his grandson had taught him to navigate, entering the pickup location carefully, waiting patiently at the designated spot. The Air Force Cross hanging around Hunter's neck was no ordinary medal. It was the second highest military decoration that could be awarded to a member of the United States Air Force, ranking just below the Medal of Honor. Hunter had received it in 1982, though the mission it recognized had taken place years earlier over the Soviet Union. The citation remained partially classified even now, the specifics of his actions hidden behind layers of national security protocols. The medal itself was beautiful and weighty, a bronze cross pâté with a gold-plated American bald eagle in the center, suspended from a distinctive red, white, and blue ribbon. Hunter wore it today because he'd been asked to speak at a high school assembly later that week about his service, and he'd wanted to bring the medal to show the students. He'd kept it in his pocket during his appointment, but had hung it around his neck as he exited the hospital, planning to secure it better once he got in the car. The chain was visible outside his shirt, the cross resting against his chest, gleaming in the Patanz, Colorado sunlight. Brandon Lee had been driving for Uber for 8 months, treating it as a side hustle while he worked his way through a business degree he wasn't particularly passionate about. Brandon was 22, ambitious in a shallow way, obsessed with his driver rating and maximizing his earnings per hour. He'd developed a system for screening passengers, canceling on those he deemed unprofitable, elderly people who move slowly, passengers with multiple stops, anyone going to locations in low-traffic areas. His acceptance rate was terrible, but Brandon didn't care. He'd figured out how to game the system just enough to avoid permanent deactivation while maintaining what he considered efficiency. When the request had come through for a pickup at the VA hospital, Brandon had rolled his eyes. VA hospital meant veteran, probably old, probably slow, definitely not someone who'd add a generous tip. He'd accepted the ride only because he was close and had nothing better immediately available. But as he'd pulled up and seen Hunter, clearly elderly, moving with careful deliberation, Brandon's impatience had crystallized into decision. Brandon had pulled to the curb, watched Hunter begin to approach the vehicle, and made his judgment in seconds. The old man moved stiffly, would probably take forever getting in and out, would likely need help with a seatbelt, might try to make small talk about the old days. Brandon wanted none of it. He'd grabbed his phone, tapped the cancel button, and as he'd done it, he'd muttered his reasoning loud enough for Hunter to hear through the open window. Old people take too long and don't tip. Cancel. The cruelty was casual, almost reflexive, the thoughtless dismissal of someone Brandon considered not worth his time. Hunter had stopped mid-step, the words hitting him with unexpected force. He'd simply stood there as Brandon had pulled away, merging back into the traffic circle that looped through the hospital complex. For a moment, Hunter had felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Insignificance, as if his life and service meant nothing to the world he'd once helped protect. Brandon had checked his rearview mirror as he'd accelerated away, a habitual glance to ensure he hadn't left anything behind or caused a traffic issue. What he'd seen in that mirror had made him do a double-take, though he hadn't fully processed its significance. The old man stood on the curb, and around his neck, clearly visible even at increasing distance, was something that caught the light. Something bronze and metallic suspended from a distinctive ribbon. Brandon's brain had registered it as jewelry, perhaps a necklace. Nothing important. He dismissed it and focused on his phone, already accepting a new ride request from downtown. What Brandon had failed to recognize, what his generation's disconnection from military history and tradition had left him ignorant about, was that he'd just abandoned a man wearing one of the nation's highest military decorations. That ignorance was about to cost him dearly. Maria Santos had been sitting in her car in the VA hospital parking lot, finishing a phone call with her son Diego before heading inside for a volunteer shift. Maria was 53, a nurse who donated time each week to help veterans navigate their appointments and paperwork. Her son Diego was a Marine Corps Lance Corporal currently deployed in the Middle East, and Maria's volunteer work was her way of honoring his service and the service of all who'd worn the uniform. She'd been about to end her call when she'd noticed the interaction at the curb. A silver Honda pulling up to an elderly veteran, then pulling away almost immediately. The brevity of the stop had caught her attention, and then she'd seen the old man's posture, the slump of defeat in his shoulders. Maria had said goodbye to Diego quickly, promising to call him later, and had looked more closely at the veteran on the curb. That's when she'd seen it. Even from across the parking lot, the Air Force cross was unmistakable. Maria's father had been Air Force, and she'd grown up around military culture. She knew the ribbons, knew the medals, knew that particular bronze cross meant something extraordinary. Maria had felt anger rise in her chest, hot and immediate. She'd watched the silver Honda drive away, and without thinking, she'd grabbed her phone and started her camera. The car was still visible, maybe 50 yards away, and Maria had zoomed in, capturing the license plate clearly. Colorado tags, reading DJX 4729. She'd taken 3 photos, making sure at least one showed the plate sharply. Then she jumped out of her car and hurried toward the elderly veteran, who still stood on the curb, looking lost and tired. "Sir," she'd called out as she approached. "Sir, are you all right? Did that driver just refuse you?" Hunter had turned to her, his weathered face showing confusion and lingering hurt. "He canceled," Hunter had said simply. "Said old people take too long and don't tip." Maria had felt her anger intensify. She'd looked down at the medal hanging from Hunter's neck, at the distinctive Air Force cross, and felt tears threatening. "Sir," she'd said, her voice thick with emotion, "may I drive you wherever you need to go? Please. It would be an honor." Hunter had been taken aback by her intensity, by the tears in her eyes. "Ma'am, you don't have to—" Maria had shaken her head firmly. "My son is a Marine, deployed right now. You served, you wore that medal, which means you did something extraordinary, and some punk kid just abandoned you because he couldn't be bothered. Please let me help you." Hunter had looked down at his chest, noticing for the first time that his Air Force cross had fallen outside his shirt, was hanging visibly. He'd reached up to tuck it back in, but Maria had stopped him. "Don't hide it," she'd said. "You earned it. Wear it proudly." Hunter had smiled slightly, the first smile since being abandoned. "All right then. I need to get home if you're sure it's no trouble." Maria had practically beamed. "No trouble at all, sir. My volunteer shift can wait. This is more important. She'd guided him to her car, helped him into the passenger seat with gentle care, and made sure he was comfortable before closing the door. As Maria had driven, she'd asked Hunter about his service, learning he'd been an Air Force pilot, though he'd remained vague about the details. Reconnaissance work, he'd said. Flew some interesting missions during the Cold War. That's about all I can say without getting into classified territory. Maria had nodded, understanding that some things remained secret even decades later. She'd told him about Diego, about her volunteer work at the VA, about her father's Air Force service. The conversation had been warm, comfortable, and by the time they'd reached Hunter's modest home in a quiet suburb, they'd exchanged phone numbers. "You ever need a ride to the VA, you call me," Maria had insisted. "Don't use those rideshare apps. Some of these drivers don't have any respect." Hunter had thanked her profusely, and as he'd gotten out of the car, Maria had made a decision. She'd pulled out her phone and opened Facebook. The post Maria had created was simple but devastating. She'd uploaded the clearest photo of Brandon's license plate along with a description of what she'd witnessed. This Uber driver canceled on an elderly Air Force veteran outside the Denver VA hospital today, loudly stating, "Old people take too long and don't tip." The veteran he abandoned was wearing an Air Force Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor. This driver needs to be held accountable. Share this so Uber sees what kind of people represent their company. She'd included hashtags: Veteran Respect, Uber Shame, Air Force Cross, Denver VA. Maria had over 2,000 Facebook friends, many of them connected to military families and veteran organizations. Within an hour, her post had been shared 50 times. Within 3 hours, it had been shared 500 times. By evening, it was approaching 5,000 shares. Someone had identified Brandon Lee by his license plate through connections at the DMV, and his photo, pulled from his social media accounts, was now circulating alongside the story. Brandon's phone had started blowing up around 7 that evening. Text messages, emails, notifications from every social media platform. Friends warning him that his name and photo were going viral, strangers sending him hateful messages, veteran organizations tagging him in posts condemning his actions. Brandon had been confused at first, then terrified as he'd read the story spreading across the internet. The photo of his license plate was everywhere, and people had connected it to his Uber profile. His rating had dropped precipitously as people who'd never ridden with him left 1-star reviews and scolding comments. Brandon had tried to defend himself in a few comment threads, claiming he'd been misunderstood, that he hadn't known the old man was a veteran, that he had the right to cancel rides. Each attempt had made things worse. People had screenshot his defensive comments and shared them as further evidence of his disrespect. By 10 that night, Brandon had received an email from Uber. "Your driver account has been permanently deactivated due to violations of our community guidelines and multiple reports of discriminatory behavior. This decision is final and cannot be appealed." The next morning, a local news crew had tracked down Joseph McDonald through the VA hospital, where Maria Santos had mentioned him to a public affairs officer. The reporter, a veteran journalist named Patricia Kendall, had called Hunter and requested an interview. "Mr. McDonald, a story is circulating about you being abandoned by an Uber driver. We'd like to hear your perspective and learn more about your service." Hunter had been reluctant initially, never comfortable with attention, but Patricia had been persuasive. "Sir, people need to hear your story. They need to know who you are, what you did. And frankly, that driver's behavior represents a larger problem, our society's disconnection from those who served." Hunter had agreed, and the news crew had arrived at his home that afternoon. They'd filmed in his living room, where photographs and memorabilia from his Air Force career decorated the walls. Patricia had conducted the interview with respect and genuine interest, asking about the Air Force Cross, about his service. Hunter had explained, as much as he was allowed, about his time flying reconnaissance missions during the Cold War. "I flew the SR-71 Blackbird," he'd said, and Patricia's eyes had widened. The SR-71 was legendary, the fastest, highest-flying manned aircraft ever built, capable of speeds over Mach 3 and altitudes above 85,000 feet. We flew missions over Soviet territory, photographing military installations, gathering intelligence that was critical to national security. The Soviets fired missiles at us, but we were too high and too fast for them to hit. Every mission was dangerous. Equipment failures at that altitude and speed could be fatal, but we had a job to do. He'd touched the Air Force Cross around his neck. I received this for a mission in 1979 where we suffered a major systems failure over Soviet airspace. We managed to keep the aircraft under control, complete the reconnaissance objectives, and get back to friendly territory. It was intense. The citation remained classified, so Hunter couldn't elaborate, but Patricia had understood that whatever he'd done had been extraordinary. The interview had aired that evening on the local news, and the story had exploded nationally. Major networks had picked it up. Uber driver abandons Air Force hero became a trending topic. The contrast was perfect for the news cycle. Disrespectful young person versus humble veteran hero. Hunter's story about flying the SR-71, about classified missions over the Soviet Union, about receiving the Air Force Cross, had captured public imagination. Suddenly, Brandon Lee wasn't just some random driver who'd been rude. He'd abandoned a man who'd literally flown at the edge of space to protect American security during the Cold War. The backlash against Brandon had intensified. He'd been recognized in public, confronted, forced to delete all his social media accounts. He'd lost his Uber income and found himself unhireable in the gig economy as his story followed him across platforms. His dreams of coasting through college with easy side hustle money had evaporated, replaced by the harsh reality that actions have consequences, especially when they involve disrespecting someone who'd sacrificed so much. Maria Santos had become an unexpected hero in the story, praised for her quick action and for standing up for Hunter. She'd given several interviews herself, always redirecting attention back to Hunter and to the broader issue of how society treated veterans. "We ask these men and women to serve, to put their lives on the line, and then we forget about them," she'd said on camera. "We let them be dismissed, disrespected, treated as inconvenient. That has to change." Her son Diego had called from overseas, having heard about his mother's viral post through his unit's social media channels. "Mom, you're famous," he'd said, pride evident in his voice. "Thanks for standing up for that veteran. That's exactly why I serve, to protect people like him and to hopefully be treated with respect when I'm old like you're showing him." Maria had laughed through tears, telling him to stay safe and come home soon. Hunter MacDonald returned to his quiet life, though it was slightly less quiet now. He received letters from around the country, from veterans and civilians thanking him for his service and apologizing for Brandon's behavior. The high school where he'd agreed to speak had turned his visit into a major event, inviting media and other veterans. Hunter had spoken to an auditorium full of students about service, sacrifice, and the importance of respecting those who came before. He'd shown them his Air Force Cross, explained what the SR-71 Blackbird was, shared sanitized stories from his missions. The students had been riveted, many crying, all of them offering standing ovations. Hunter had ended his talk with a simple message. Service isn't about recognition, it's about duty, about doing what's right even when it's hard, even when people don't appreciate it. But when you see someone who served, whether they're wearing a medal or not, treat them with respect. They earned it. Maria Santos drove him to and from that event, refusing to let him use rideshare apps ever again. They'd become friends, their connection forged through that moment outside the VA hospital when one person chose decency, while another chose cruelty. Subscribe to this channel if you believe our veterans deserve honor, not abandonment. If you believe service should be recognized and respected. And if you understand that real heroes often fly in silence, carry their medals humbly, and deserve our gratitude, not our dismissal.